Let me jump in by taking us back for a very brief recap of where we are. And I want to make some notes on this map. If you remember in our last lesson, David had been anointed king over Judah. You see David here in the southern kingdom. And one of Saul's sons, named Ishbosheth, had been named king of the 11 tribes in the northern part of Israel. Saul, if you remember, and David and two of his other sons had been killed in a battle with the Philistines. And in fact, they had fled. The Israelites fled. As a matter of fact, you can see on this map that the city that is the capital of Ishbosheth's northern kingdom is actually outside the promised land. It's east of the Jordan River. That's because the Philistines conquered them, killed Saul, and literally inhabited the villages and the towns of the Israelites. The Israelites are kind of back to where they started 400 years earlier with Moses looking into the promised land because the Philistines have kicked them out. And so David becomes king of the southern part, Ishbosheth, king of the northern part. Now David had a general, I'll write his name here. His name is Joab. And Ishbosheth had a general named Abner. Abner was Saul's general of his armies and continued with Ishbosheth. Now, David didn't want a civil war, and David didn't want to fight against Ishbosheth. He had not killed Saul when he had the chance. He had not really rebelled against it. He'd spent most of his 20s, almost a decade probably, running away from Saul, not willing to fight his fellow Israelites. But Joab took the army of David and met Abner and the army of Ishbosheth, and they sat down, and instead of making peace, those two men, it came to blows. Things got out of hand and the two armies fought. Well, as they fought, Abner killed Joab's little brother in battle, and that sealed the fate of the enmity between the two men. Well, as the two parted, Abner went back and realized that Ishbosheth was not a good king. And so he talked to the leaders of the northern kingdom and said, David has been anointed by God, and let's give our allegiance to David. So Abner came to David and made peace, and David was perfectly willing to make peace before this war got out of hand. But Joab, when he learned of this, recognizing he had a blood feud, called Abner back for a peace conference and murdered him. Well, David then became king of the whole 12 tribes, all of Israel. But David distanced himself from Joab, and he condemned that action, but he didn't discipline Joab. And that's a theme that will run through David's life. And I want you to hold that thought. Ishbosheth was murdered by some of his own men, and David punished them. He had no desire to lift his hand against the family of Saul, or as the Bible calls it, the house of Saul, the descendants of Saul. Well, David inherited a kingdom that was in dire straits. This area of Ishbosheth you see on the map, and David, they don't really hold all that territory. The Philistines are living in many of those cities, and I want to survey around them because the first thing that David has to deal with is the enemies pressing in from around. They sense weakness in Israel in this struggle for the kingship. They sense a lack of unity, and they decide now is our time to strike. Of course, on the west, in the plains by the sea, you have the Philistines in Philistia. The Philistines are by far the most powerful, technologically capable military force in this region. To the southeast, you have Moab and the Moabites, who are traditional enemies of the Israelites, even from the time of the Exodus. Then, of course, Ammon, what is today is modern Jordan, the Ammonites. And then in the north, you have Syria. You're also going to see this word, Aram, or Arameans. And for our purposes, I want you to think about that as Syrians. Those are people that lived in this area. Aram, Damascus. Damascus was the capital of that country. And then further north, it isn't on this map, but you're going to see it in our reading, is a kingdom called Zobah. And it's a little north of Syria as you would go near the Euphrates River. And so all of these nations are hostile to the Israelites, and they all sense a weakness at this time. And so what happens first? The Philistines, as we begin our story, for this lesson in 2 Samuel chapter 5. The Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, meaning over all 12 of the tribes. And they went up in full force to search for him. In other words, they thought, let's crush this now. They know that David is a good leader. They know that David is a military man. And so they think, let's crush them while they're weak. But David heard about it, and he went down to the strongholds. He's in Jerusalem, the city he conquered in our last lesson and made the city of David. Now the Philistines had come and spread out in the valley of Rephaim, which is just southwest of Israel. I'll show you a map, or Jerusalem, excuse me. I'll show you a map in just a second. And David inquired of the Lord. Now you see this over and over. David prayed to the Lord. David said, Lord, what would you have me do? Instead of David saying, look, I know how to handle this. I have a battle plan. I'm going to go out and I'm going to defeat him. He turns to God and he said, God, guide me. God, what do you want to do with your enemies, the Philistines? And he said, shall I go and attack the Philistines? Will you give me favor in battle? And the Lord says, go, I will surely hand the Philistines over to you. Now this is the way David has behaved ever since he was a young boy and he fought Goliath. It didn't matter about how big Goliath was. It doesn't matter how technologically superior or how numerous the Philistines are. David still has the idea that if God says he's going to defeat them, we will prevail. And so David went to Baal Perazim where he defeated them. And as waters break out, the Lord has broken out against my enemies. So that place was called Baal Perazim. The Philistines abandoned their idols there, meaning they had brought their tokens, their idols, the images of their gods, and he so routed them that they fled, leaving their idols. And David and his men carried them off. A second time, the Philistines regrouped sometime later. I'm going to put these two things together because I want you to see the Philistines realize that the tide is turning and that David is the leader and that there is indeed a God in Israel, and they're trying to stamp this out quickly, and they fail. Once more the Philistines came up, spread out in the valley of Rephaim. So David inquired of the Lord, and he said, do not go straight against them, but circle around behind and attack them from behind. As soon as you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the trees, move quickly. That will mean the Lord has gone out in front of you to strike the Philistine army. So David did as the Lord commanded him, and he struck down the Philistines all the way from Gibeon to Gezer. Let me show you, switch to a map now, and show you kind of where we are in this. So David is in Jerusalem, the city he has recently conquered and fortified. He's made it the capital of Israel because it's literally right on the border between the northern tribes and his own tribe of Judah. And it's a very smart political move to say, look, I'm representing all of Israel, not just my own tribe. And he literally moves his capital city to sort of a neutral site. Well, the Philistines are coming from Gath, one of their great cities, and you see this is blown up here. And the valley of Rephaim, which is a great approach to Jerusalem, so the Philistines are coming up that way, but David defeats them twice, and they flee all the way back to another Philistine city, Gezer, in that area. And so David, by turning to the Lord, and see, this is such a contrast with Saul, isn't it? Saul placed his confidence in solving the nation's problems. This is almost prescient for 21st century America. But Saul placed his confidence in solving the nation's problem in their political alliances and their military might and their own strategies, their own intelligence. David, one of the themes in his life, while he's a good military commander, he's a good politician, he's an intelligent man, even so, David places his trust not in political solutions, but in God. And then he executes them to the best of the abilities that God has given him. And that's a great lesson, I think, for us as Christians in the 21st century world, is our trust is not in politics. We'll follow the plan of the Lord and then use the gifts he's given us to execute it as well as we can in this world. Well, that's what David did, and God was giving him success. As we move on, 2 Samuel 8, in the course of time, so now we're talking about a few years are passing, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, meaning as time went on and further battles, he literally defeats them. It doesn't mean that the Israelites went in and took over all that territory. He didn't kill all the Philistines, but he caused them to surrender and make a truce. He took cities from the control of them, but he also made them pay tribute and guarantees, if you will, that you will not attack us and you will pay taxes to us. The Israelites basically were controlling this area, part of the promised land. David also defeated the Moabites. Remember the southeast, on the east side of the Dead Sea? They also attacked, and David defeated them. He made them lie down on the ground, the men, and measured them off with a length of cord. Every 2 lengths of them were put to death, and the 3rd length was allowed to live. So the Moabites became subject to David and brought tribute. This sounds a little brutal to us, but actually this is nothing in the ancient world. This is merciful. It's very common to completely destroy all the men of any military age and completely devastate a nation, and then move your own people in, take all of their women and children as slaves to you. David isn't doing that. David is indeed conquering people. I make no apology for that. But notice what he does. He leaves men to work. He leaves them without an army that can cause more trouble, but he leaves their independence, farm your lands, live in peace. You will pay us tribute, and we will protect you. It was a 2-way arrangement. Nevertheless, as brutal as this sounds, this is very merciful and very enlightened for its time. David fought against Haradetsu, son of Rehob, king of Zobah. So this is even further north. I'll show you on the map in a second. When he went to restore his control along the Euphrates River, David captured 1,000 of his chariots, 7,000 charioteers, and 20,000 foot soldiers. He hamstrung all but 100 of the chariot horses. Again, you see this same pattern. Sounds brutal to us. That is unbelievably. People of that time were saying, David is a fool to not kill all the men. David is a fool to not kill all the horses and burn all the chariots and completely devastate this land. That's the way you conquer places. That's not David's intent. And I would argue that historically, that's not Israel's intent. Israel's intent is to live in the promised land and live at peace with their neighbors. And David, in his time, is a model of mercy and enlightenment to the nations around him. When the Arameans of Damascus, the Syrians, came to help Haradetsu, king of Zobah, David struck down 22,000 of them. He put garrisons in the Aramean kingdom of Damascus, and the Arameans became subject to him and brought tribute. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. So what's happened? He has subdued the nations around him. He's been merciful, believe it or not, in the sense that he has not destroyed them completely, and he has basically built peace in this area. This is a map. The green area is what David has now conquered. We've done this in kind of fast motion. But basically, the gray area there is the heart of Israel. There's Jerusalem, the capital. But Edom and Amalek and Moab, I'm just highlighting all these nations, Philistines, Syria, Zobah, all of these areas are subject to control of David, but not. Those people are still living in their lands. They're under David's protection. They're farming. They're playing soccer on Saturdays. In other words, this is the land that God gave to Israel. But David allows those native people to live there. But they control this area. The thing I want to talk about here is, first of all, the relative enlightened way in which David does this. And I say relative because that's not, well, I shouldn't say that's not our standard. It's not what we as 21st century Americans like, but if you look around our world, way more brutal things than this are happening in our world. The world hasn't changed. And the second thing, though, is if you look at the boundaries of the green area on this map, and you go back to Genesis chapter 15, verse 18. Now, when you go back, you're going back 1,000 years. This is around roughly 1,000 BC. Genesis 15 is 2000 BC. God talking to Abraham saying, I know you don't even have a child yet, but you're going to become a great nation. Here they are, the 12 tribes of Israel. And I'm going to give them a land in which they live. Here they are. And in Genesis 15, he talks about the rough boundaries of the land. These are the boundaries mentioned in Genesis 15. And so in the kingship of David, you see finally the fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham 1,000 years before. They are a great nation in the promised land, and David and the Israelites now basically have the area that God described to Abraham 1,000 years earlier. And so this kingdom of David is thought of by the Jews as kind of a golden era. It's the era of promises fulfilled. God had made a covenant with Abraham, then later a covenant with Moses as he brought the people out of Egypt. And in a few moments, you're going to see he makes another covenant with David. And every one of these covenants, every one of these agreements, every one of these promises and promises fulfilled is moving God's plan of redemption closer and closer to Jesus Christ. I want you to see what's happening to David as a great story about David and great lessons of faith for us, but also this is in the line of a thousands-year-old plan of God to move all of humanity toward redemption, towards reconciliation. So everything that's happening now is part of something God planned literally before the foundation of the world. Well, that's where David is. He's got peace around him. He's not trying to conquer Egypt. He's not going to invade Egypt. He's not going to invade in the north, the Assyrians that are living up in the north. He doesn't want more territory. Where does he stop? He stops where God told them their promised land was. So David is not going to engage in any wars of conquest past this. So he settles down to reign. And there are 3 episodes in this beginning of the reign of David that I want to highlight. And so the first is, I want to talk about the ark. Now, if you remember, the ark, I'll show you what it is in a minute, but it basically was created by the law of Moses, and they built this ark, and it's a box, and it's covered with gold, and in it are the 10 Commandments. And this was a special artifact, and it became a special place. I'll talk about it in a minute. But where is it? What's happened to the ark? The ark is the national, I hate to say it's a national symbol of Israel, but it is a holy thing, and it is a holy place because God literally dwelt on that ark. In other words, when God visited his people and God in the midst of his people, that's where it was. The ark, later when the temple is built, right now there's a tent, a tabernacle, that came with them through all the wanderings in the desert, and inside is the ark, and only the high priest would go in there. And yet God would send up messages, and the smoke and his presence lived there where the ark was. Well, if you remember, Saul was having trouble before this time fighting the Philistines, and one of the things Saul thought was the Philistines bring the images of their God out to encourage them, saying, our God is literally looking at you. You better go fight really well. And so Saul had this idea that, well, we're getting beaten. Let's bring the ark out, and we'll see if that won't encourage our troops. Well, it was a foolish thing to do. It's not foolish to ask God to be with you, or as David did, to say, Lord, shall we go out? Are you going in front of us? But Saul used it more like a talisman, like a magic thing that basically if the ark is there, maybe that means we'll fight better. Well, they lost, and they lost the ark, and the Philistines took it. You may remember this story from earlier in the book of Samuel. But the Philistines took it back to their cities. I'll tell you the short version of this. Back to their cities, and everywhere they put it, trouble came. And they said, whoa, this thing and the God of those Israelites, bad news. We should not have this ark. And so eventually they put it on a cart and put some oxen and just sent it down the valley. Well, it came to a town, I'm shortening this story, Kiryat Yarim is the name of the town. It came to the town, and the people there go, oh my gosh, this is the ark, it's back. And so they kept the ark there. And so there it stayed through all of this other adventure, Saul trying to kill David, and Saul finally being killed by the Philistines, and now David anointed king and defeating him. And so now that the kingdom is at peace, the first thing David does, let's move on, is he goes to get the ark. And let me read this to you, and I'll make several observations about this. David brought together out of Israel chosen men, 30,000 in all. These are the most important people. These are the senators. These are the presidents of the Chamber of Commerce. These are the Congress people. He's bringing all the important people out of all the 12 tribes, and he brought them together. And he and all his men set out to bring up from Kiryat Yarim the ark of God, which is called by the name, meaning it is God's presence. It's a holy thing, which is called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim. These are angels that are on the ark. I'll show you a picture in a minute. They set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which is where it was. And as Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were guiding the new cart with the ark of God on it, and Ahio was walking in front. And David and the whole house of Israel, meaning all 30,000 of these important people, they're having a big parade as they bring it to Jerusalem. We're celebrating with all their might before the Lord with songs and harps and lyres and tambourines. So let me stop and make a couple of observations here. First, on the one hand, spiritually, this is the little piece of this story, so I'll knock it out of the way. Great idea to bring the ark, which is the presence of God, and the tent, by the way, of meeting in which it was placed, bring it to Jerusalem, which is now the capital of the tribes of Israel. It's a symbol of God keeping his promise. Look, indeed, here's our land, they would say. Here's God in the midst of us. He has done what he said 1,000 years earlier. It has come true. Our God is literally with us. That's what the ark represented. So spiritually, this is a good idea. But look what's happening. David is also using this powerful religious symbol in a very political way. He is going to say, look, we're going to have a big old parade, and we're going to put this on a big cart and roll it up to Jerusalem, and all the important people are going to be here. David is using this religious symbol as a way to unify the nation politically. Now, that's not anything that started with David. It happened before then. It's not anything that doesn't happen today. If you think about our current election in America, both of the candidates of our major parties for president have tapped into religious symbols as a way to legitimate themselves with the religious portion of our people, and as a unifying figure. If you look at it, you'll see that both of our candidates make a point of being filmed coming out of Mass, for example, or holding up a Bible, or talking about their faith. This is what David was effectively doing. He's taking this powerful religious symbol, the ark for them, and using it to unify the people. Well, God doesn't typically like to be used for political purposes. The second problem with this is God had given very specific instructions back in the book of Exodus and said, when you move the ark, you don't put it on a cart. It's supposed to be carried by the Levites. These are the tribe of Levi, and they were sort of like the priests. They served all the other tribes of Israel. In other words, they would make the sacrifices on their behalf, and they would serve before God as the priests of Israel, and they were supposed to carry it. And they weren't supposed to put it on a cart. I'll show you how it's supposed to be carried, but what you see happening here comes to look a little more political than spiritual, and it's not the way God said that it should be done. Well, before we go on with the story, let me pause for a second and talk about the ark for just a minute. The ark, no one really knows what happened to the ark. About 300 years from now, roughly, a little over that, the Babylonians are going to destroy Jerusalem in 300 years from when we're talking about, and the ark is going to kind of disappear. The last time the ark was actually seen was by Indiana Jones. And so this is the last we know of the ark. By the way, all joking aside, that is how the ark is supposed to be carried, what you see in that picture. It was made with rings so that long poles could be put in it, and the Levites would carry it as they marched. It wasn't supposed to be on a cart. In other words, what David is doing is really ignoring a lot of what God has commanded for his own purposes, if you will, and the leaders of Israel are doing the same thing. Let me show you a picture. It's a great rendition of the ark, particularly this picture on the left. This is made up from the description in the book of Exodus, but it's a box that's covered in gold. On top of it, you see those winged figures, and we're guessing what those look like. I mean, pretty accurate, but basically the idea of the image of an angel, and I'm not saying angels have wings, but this is how they're described. And so you see these two cherubs, we would say in English, these two angels with their wings folded over the top of the ark. Inside this ark, a couple of things, but basically think 10 Commandments. Think Charlton Heston put the stone tablets inside the ark. It is a sign of their covenant with God. And not only that, God came down and his presence was literally there on the top of the ark. It was called the mercy seat. It was the place where God came to dispense mercy to his people, his presence to his people. So wherever the ark was, that was the presence of God. And so that's what the ark is, and that's why David is bringing it to Jerusalem. Not a bad idea spiritually, but the way he did it is very, very inappropriate, and I would argue the purposes for which he did it are very inappropriate. So what happens? When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, in other words, they're on their way to Jerusalem, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark of God because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. No one is supposed to touch that. Therefore, God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark of God. David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out. You can see David, you can see us rationalizing, look, I'm trying to do a good thing here. I'm bringing it up. And God's like, I see your heart. I know exactly what you're doing here. But that's not what I told you to do. This is not how I've ever told you to do it. For the 400 years the ark has been in existence, no one has ever done this. And so he became angry. And he wasn't willing to take the ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. Instead, he stopped and took it to the house of a man named Obed-Edom. This guy's not an Israelite. You can tell by his name and the fact that he's a Gittite. He's almost certainly not an Israelite. So he goes, let's park this thing here. And the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom for the Gittite for 3 months. And the Lord blessed him and his entire household. And so David was afraid. I want to make this point because I want to stop here and I want to talk about this for a minute. David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, how can I bring this into my own house? Could this happen to me if I too disobey? And so he became afraid of the Lord. And I want to talk about this for just a second. We typically have a problem as modern people with our modern sensibilities. I say that with a tongue in cheek. We don't like what happened to Uzzah. And here's why. We typically think, look, he did touch the ark. He wasn't supposed to do it, but it just sure seems out of proportion here that a man should die because of this. It just doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem proportional. It doesn't really seem reasonable to us. This isn't reasonable. And I want you to flip around for a minute and let go of our 21st century sensibilities and our self-centeredness in thinking that we know best throughout all of history, and flip this around. I'm going to give you a metaphor, and it's not a perfect metaphor. So you'll see that this comparison isn't perfect, but I hope it gives you a little bit of an idea. There are 2 reasons for this, the why this happened. The first is this. Before I worked here, before I became a pastor in the business world, and to make a long story short, one of my clients years and years ago was electric company. And I remember being out, and long story, but we're looking at some of their facilities, et cetera. And I'm really relatively closer than I want to be, to an unbelievably high power electric line. And so they had assured me that you're fine. You just stay right there and you'll be fine. Now, I'm not so sure because I was pretty nervous about this. In fact, I was kind of afraid, even though I realized they said I was safe. But then again, who knows? Maybe they go back to the office and they say, oh, another sales guy just got fried, total accident. I'm like, no, not happening to me. But I'm close enough that I can feel it. I mean, literally I can feel it. Well, you know, it's because of the field that's around it, et cetera. But my point is this, is they said, you know, you are perfectly safe. Now, don't touch it, but you're perfectly safe. And yet I'm scared. I mean, I literally am, you can call it, I had a healthy respect. Well, actually, that would be giving me a lot of credit. I was actually scared. Like, I don't even want to be this close to it, right? And we do have that sense of fear. That's a healthy fear. We teach our children that kind of fear of, you know, you can be safe around things with power. You know, when our children learn to drive, I hope you give them all the, you know, the lecture that you are now driving something, you are now operating something that could kill someone. I mean, this is not something you take lightly. I certainly didn't take that experience lightly. I want you to think about the holiness of God. This is where it's not a perfect analogy. But God is so holy, and his dwelling place, even though that's not God himself, is so holy and so filled with power that being near it, you need to have a healthy fear and a healthy respect. God cannot tolerate sin in his presence, and God will destroy sin. That is the message from Genesis to the book of Revelation, is justice will be done and sin will be destroyed. And so in one sense, the holiness of God cannot tolerate that touch of sin. The second reason this happens is simply obedience. Think about when we look at this and we say, wait, that's a little bit much. What are we really saying? We're really saying, look, I will respect you as long as it's reasonable, and I will obey you as long as I agree with what you're doing. That's what we're really saying. We're saying, look, I don't think that's right. I don't think God did the right thing there. What are we saying? We're saying, look, as long as your values, your rules conform to what I think is reasonable, I'll go along with them. And if not, I won't. Well, you and I might think that way. I can assure you God does not. God says, no, I made you. I made a covenant with you, Israel, and these are the rules, and I expect you to obey. If you love me, obey me. And so for those two reasons, that's why this happens. David becomes afraid. And we don't like that word being afraid either. We think, well, wait a minute. Should we really be afraid of God? Is fear of the Lord, by the way, you're going to see fear of the Lord all through the Bible. And sometimes we kind of dilute it and we say, well, it just means respecting God. Well, it certainly does mean that. And sometimes we mean cringe in fear, he may smite you. Neither one of those two extremes really capture the idea. It really is fear of the Lord. But it's a healthy fear. And you know who described this best? I'm excited to show you this because if you haven't read these, I would urge you to. But C.S. Lewis, atheist turned Christian, great writer, and he wrote this novel, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And in this novel, it's barely, it's not even intended to be concealed, but the lion Aslan is a Christ figure. And so the story is really emulating a little bit the gospel. And so the young girl Susan has yet to meet this powerful lion who is going to fight the evil in the world. Evil is threatening to take over. And here's a beautiful little passage that describes this. And so she's talking to Mr. Beaver, the animal, and he says, Aslan is a lion. The lion, he's the great lion. And Susan said, oh, I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. Safe, said Mr. Beaver. Who said anything about him being safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. C.S. Lewis captured perfectly the fear of the Lord. He's not safe. The Lord is not my servant, my teddy bear, subject to my whims or my morals or my judgment. He's not safe, but he loves me, and he's good. That's exactly what is meant by the fear of the Lord. You can see David taking that in a very casual way here. He thought he could just co-opt the ark for his political purposes. He thought he was doing God a favor by bringing the ark there, and he was angry. God, why are you doing this? And then he became afraid, realizing, well, this is what happens when you infringe on the holiness of God and when we disobey God. Sometimes we think of God as, we want him to think kind of the teddy bear God. This is really popular in certain kinds of Christianity. It always has been, but it is right now. And we emphasize how much God loves you, and that is true. And we should not speak any less about that than we already do. You cannot overemphasize how much God loves us. Unfortunately, if we aren't careful, we can give a one-dimensional view of God. He does indeed love us. And he is indeed sovereign, and he will indeed judge the world. In other words, let God be who he is. And so if we get this image of God as only love or only sentimentality, we get this idea of kind of a teddy bear God. I'll tell you how Sigmund Freud described this. And if we aren't careful, we can slip into this. And it is, he said, some people think of God as a great father figure, a cosmic father figure, someone that will wrap me up and keep me safe, someone who will protect me, someone who won't correct me or criticize me. It's sort of a longing of humanity, Freud said, to have some father figure to protect me from all the difficulties in this world. So Freud was an atheist for that reason. He said, that's all this is. And if we aren't careful, we can make that all God is. Well, that's not all God is. In fact, God so loved the world, he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not be condemned, but will live eternal life. And then it goes on to say, and those who don't believe are condemned already. And so you get this holistic view of God, and with that comes a very healthy fear of God. In other words, he is God, and I am not, and he loves me, and I love him, and that means I obey. Well, that's where David went wrong, and this story's a powerful story because I think it has a lot of implications for us. And I'll let you think about that, and we'll move on. And hopefully in the discussion questions on the handout, if you'd like, maybe explore that a little bit more. I'd like you to think around that a little bit. Well, the second incident that happens is David speaks to the prophet Nathan, who comes into our story now. We don't know anything else about him, but he's a holy man. He's a prophet of God. And so he is speaking to David, and David says, you know what? I live in a nice house, and God doesn't. And I want to build a temple for God, a place for the ark to dwell permanently. And God comes back and says to him, no, I appreciate what you're doing. I love that sentiment, but that's not my plan. I want to show you this interchange between God and David. And the most important one for us, I think, is David. So David has, by the way, seen that God does bless the family that's keeping the ark, and so he brings it up properly. He has the Levites carry it, and he has not so much a big celebration, political celebration, but a worship service of the bringing of God to his people. So, God says, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture and from following the flock to be ruler over my people. I've been with you wherever you've gone. I've cut off all your enemies from before you. Remember, he's living at peace now. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men of the earth, and I will provide a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore as they did at the beginning. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. The word house, let me pause there in Hebrew, means several things. It can mean a house. It can mean a dwelling place, but it often also means of a person. The house of David, the house of Ahab, the house of whoever can mean your descendants, your family line, and that's the sense it means here. He says, when your days are over and you rest with your fathers, when you die, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you. He will come from your own body. This will be one of your sons, and I will establish his kingdom. Spoiler alert, this will indeed happen with Solomon, his son. He is the one who will build a house for my name. In other words, he's the one who'll build the temple. Spoiler alert again, he does indeed build the temple. And I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Well, not so much Solomon. Maybe we're starting to shade into something else here. I will be his father, and he will be my son. Well, now we're definitely not talking about Solomon. Who are we talking about now? Establish the throne forever. This is the covenant of God with David. He said, your descendants will always be kings. Now, historically, that's not quite right. And your kingdom doesn't last forever physically here. And none of your kids are literally the son of God, except that Jesus Christ is descended from David. And God is speaking immediately, and this happens a lot in prophecy. This will immediately come true in Solomon, and it will come true in the huge sense that David can't even comprehend with David's offspring, David's, quote, son, Jesus Christ, who is the Son of God. And the final verse, your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. The kingdom of God in Jesus Christ will never, can never end. And so this is the covenant that God is making with David. This is what Moses could not have foreseen where this was going. Abraham before him could not have foreseen the end of this story. You and I, as we see these covenants, we go, oh my goodness, look what God is doing. Ever closer, ever clearer to the redemption of humanity. It's a beautiful story. But here's what I want to focus on. I want you to see David's response. David prays to God after he's told. He said, I want to build you a temple. And God says, no, you're not. Your son will, but I want to make a covenant with you. One-sided. Here's what I'm going to do for you. Does it say, David, you deserve this? No. I'm going to make your name great. I'm going to make your house great. I'm going to establish a throne that you don't understand quite how this will be true. It will endure forever. This is grace. This is God's grace, not David's merit. And yet he says, you are going to be an instrument in my kingdom and my plan, just like you and I are today. I know you don't think of yourself as King David, and we're certainly not kings. We are sons and daughters of the great king, and we are about his business in the world. So is David. David was a part of the work of God in the world. But listen to what David says. Then King David went in and sat before the Lord. He went into the tent of meeting. He sat down. All of this is very unusual, but I don't really have time to talk about the significance of all of it. I want to hit the main point. Listen to what David says. Who am I, O sovereign Lord, and what is my family that you have brought me this far? I would urge you to just memorize that verse, because one of the things I want to challenge you is pretend that you are David and pretend that you are talking to God, and start with this verse, and he's going to tell his story of what God did for him. I want you to think of my story. What would I write after this? Who am I, O sovereign Lord, and what is my family? You have brought me to this place, to who I am today. Now finish your story. Well, here's David's story. And as if this were not enough, O sovereign Lord, you have also spoken about my future. Is this your usual way of dealing with man? In other words, it's a rhetorical question that says, how much greater can this get? It reminds me a little bit, by the way, of Ephesians chapter 3 in the New Testament, where it says, God is able to do far more than we ask or even imagine. Well, that's how David's feeling right now. He said, is this how you deal with people? What more can David say to you? You know your servant, you know me, O sovereign Lord. For the sake of your word and according to your will, you have done this great thing and made it known to me. How great you are, O sovereign Lord. There is no one like you. There is no God but you, and we have heard with our own ears. Who is like your people Israel, the one nation on earth that God went out to redeem, meaning bringing them out of Egypt from slavery, as a people for himself, to make a name for himself and to perform great and awesome wonders by driving out the nations and their gods from before your people, whom you redeemed from Egypt. You have established your people Israel as your very own forever, and you, O Lord, have become their God. You see, earlier, right before this, God said, I took you when you were a shepherd boy, and now I will make your name great as the king of my people. Now, your story, my story, isn't that. It's like, oh, I was born in a humble log cabin, and now I'm, the greatest spiritual giant in the world. I mean, that's not our story, and that's not the point, is it? But if you look back, you say, that's what I was, and this is what I am. Who am I, O sovereign Lord, that you have done this for me? I just think that is a faith-building exercise, and I would just encourage you to tell your story, your David story, if you will. One more incident. And I'd like to end on this one, and this is just tucked away. I'm going to tell you the whole story. It's just on one slide. It's a little piece, but this is a brilliant insight into David's character, into the heart of David, and it is probably the story that Jesus Christ is all over this story. Well, if you remember, Saul and his sons died in battling with the Philistines, except Ishbosheth, who was then later murdered by his own men, and David became king. David had made a covenant with Jonathan, Saul's son, his best friend, if you will. They were companions of the heart. They were men of faith, men of valor, serving God together, and they were closer than brothers. and he said, I will bless your house. And Jonathan said, I know I'm not going to become king after my father, which is the way those things normally went. Saul would be king, then Jonathan would be king, and then one of Jonathan's sons would be king after him. That was the legitimate succession, if you will. And so Jonathan said, look, I know you're going to be king, but be kind to my house. Be kind to my descendants. And so David remembers this. And so here's the story of Mephibosheth. It's 2 words, easier to say, Mephibosheth. David asked, now remember, he's at peace. The Lord has given him rest and conquered his enemies. Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul, descendants of Saul, to whom I can show chesed, loving kindness or kindness for Jonathan's sake? The word hesed is translated loving kindness or kindness, and it's often attributed to God, God's loving kindness. That word hesed runs through this story. David is here emulating God in a small way, in that, how can I show kindness to any of the descendants of Saul for the sake of Jonathan? Now, first of all, I want you to put this against the right backdrop. It's always been, still is, by the way, in our world today, believe it or not, is there are lines of succession. And in ancient times, well, all times, up till today, the succession went from father to son to son to son. And so Saul was king. Jonathan should have been king according to the world's standards, but he's dead. Jonathan has a son named Mephibosheth. And so Mephibosheth has a claim to the throne. And if you read anything about Henry VIII and all those things, and the whole world, by the way, worked this way. We just probably know a little more of the English world, if you will. The idea was that person has a claim. If there are people that want to rebel against me, they're going to rebel in the name of this person who is the rightful king. And so what would people do? Why did Jonathan say, be kind to my ancestors? Because he knows the way the world works. David should send some people to quietly kill Mephibosheth. We don't want it on the evening news, but that dude has to die, because I'm not going to have some disaffected people start a rebellion and say, David is a usurper. He wasn't really the guy who should be on the throne. This is Saul's grandson. He's the guy that should be on the throne. So I want you to see the backdrop here is the whole world would expect David's going to kill him. Watch what happens. Now there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba, and they called him in before David, and the king said to him, are you Ziba? And he said, your servant. Yes, I am. He said, is there no one still alive of the family of Saul that I can show God's hesed, God's kindness? Ziba said, well, there is still a son of Jonathan, but he's crippled in both feet. You learned this story earlier, but as his nurse gathered him up to flee in a battle, he fell and as a child, and so his ankles are crippled, and so he can't walk. Where is he? The king asked. And Ziba said, he's at the house of Machir, etc. So King David had him brought into his presence. And when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. And David said, Mephibosheth, he said, here I am. He said, don't be afraid. Why does he say don't be afraid? Well, Mephibosheth knows the way the world works. I'm here. I'm going to assure him that, look at me. I'm lame. I'm not a warrior. You have no threat for me. This dude, however, is going to kill me just to be safe. He's afraid. And David says, don't be afraid. I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table in the palace. Mephibosheth bowed down and said, what is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me? And that's a euphemism, but it basically saying, who am I that you would do? You should kill me, and yet you're going to give me all of Saul's land, which is yours now. You're going to give it to me, and I'm going to eat in the palace, in the presence of the king. You've elevated me to an unbelievable status, unbelievable stature. Let me pause for a second. I want to show 2 ideas here. I want to connect this to the gospel, to our Christian way of thinking. We have 2 really key ideas about God and about what God did for us in Jesus Christ. And the first is mercy. God showed us mercy. Mercy is when you don't get something you deserve to get. So for example, if I deserve a big fine, a traffic fine, and I go before the judge and the judge says, I'm going to waive the fine. Well, that's being merciful. In other words, you should be paying this fine, but I'm not going to require you to pay the fine. Mercy is not getting something you deserve. And so for us, we deserve death for our sins. We can't come into the presence of God. We stand under judgment. We violated the covenant. And yet in Jesus Christ, God says, I won't destroy you. I will not do that. That's what David does here. He says, the whole world says, I should kill you. I will not kill you. Do not be afraid. That's mercy. The second idea is different. It's grace. If mercy is not receiving something you should get, a penalty or whatever, grace is getting something you should not get. You see the difference? Mercy is not getting something you deserve. Grace is getting something that you don't deserve at all. And so grace looks a little bit different. David shows mercy in not killing him. And he could have left it there and he would have been considered, wow, David is a merciful king. He also shows grace, and he gave Mephibosheth things he didn't deserve. You can have all of your grandfather's land. It's mine now, it's yours. I restore it to you. And you can eat at my table in the kingdom and be elevated. That's grace. That's unmerited favor. That's kindness. That's getting something you definitely don't deserve to get. And so David, this is the gospel. This story is the gospel. And he shows God's mercy and God's grace. Now I want you to fast forward and just think about this for a little bit. What if Jesus had showed us mercy? So Jesus dies on the cross and he said, all of your sins that you have committed up to this point are gone, in the sense that you will not be punished for that. That's mercy. That says, Terry, you've committed a lot of sins, and now here you are, becoming a Christian, if you will, saying to me, here I stand, judge me. And he said, you know what? I will cover all those sins. That's mercy. And you're on your own going forward. Well, I'm still in trouble, aren't I? But that is mercy. Grace said this. Grace said, not only will I forgive you those, I give you my Spirit, and it will make you holy as I am holy. And you will be adopted as a son, and you will eat at the table of the King. That's what Jesus did for us, mercy and grace. This story of David and Mephibosheth is a beautiful little story of the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, real in our lives. So we're going to leave King David until our next lesson, as God, having blessed him and placed him over the kingdom. He made a mistake with the ark. He repented. He brought it up. He's humble before God, and he expresses God's kindness. And now the years go by as David sits in prosperity. And as so often happens in prosperity, it causes a little amnesia, and David begins to forget who brought him here. In our next lesson, we see David, a very human king. I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks.